Hello and welcome back to the second episode, well, the second instalment, perhaps, in our normative ethics episode. We're now going to be dealing with utilitarianism. Shall I start then?
Yeah, you can if you want.
Yeah, and then we can move in between and so on. So, utilitarianism was found around the same time as Kantian ethics in the works of Jeremy Bentham and then John Stuart Mill. So it has its origins in Epicurean ideas of happiness being the one goal that we have above all else, and is a form, I believe it's moral naturalism, because unlike Kant's view of ethics, it didn't come just from introspection and from rational thought, but rather from looking at the world around us and drawing conclusions from the facts that exist there. So what Bentham and Mill argued, and obviously many others in their wake, was that what mattered is not whether an action was itself morally right or morally wrong, but whether the consequences that arise from those actions were right or wrong, and then drew down that rightness or wrongness not to, I don't know, courage or loyalty or other virtues, but rather to one thing, which was good, or as Bentham put it, utility. So, with that in mind, they built a system concerned with maximising the welfare of everyone, maximising utility. Sorry, that utility is separate to John Stuart Mill. I'll get onto John Stuart Mill's ideas later. And so the system then follows like this. When you take an action, make a choice, have a decision, you have got to choose the action which promotes the most utility of everyone around you, and there are certain principles for this, such as the length of the pleasure received, what are the chances of that outcome actually coming to fruition? Because obviously that is one key difference. Between deontological and teleological systems, you are not in control really of the consequences. You can try and help them, but you have to be aware that maybe not everything you want will come to pass. So the length, the possibility of the consequences, the severity, or the I can't remember the exact word, but the amount, the intensity of the pleasure received, or the pain, if you want to use the negative version, and that was what Bentham considered to be the way in which we should look at moral decision making.
Yeah.
But John Stuart Mill, Bentham called that the hedonic calculus. The value of pleasure, pain, intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, and so on. And before I actually move on to John Stuart Mill, Bentham also worked out on other aspects of it, in rather than just purely moral decision making, but broader ideas of evils of the first and second order. So, if I do a thing that is morally right now, will in the future it create an evil of the second order? So if I steal now because I'm going to die otherwise, and there's a man with 1,000 pork pies that he's not going to eat, I increase the utility then. But will in the future the fact that I have shaken the boundaries between private property end up, inviting some socialist dictator to come and steal from the rich or whatever? I don't know. That was just an example I gave. And those are second order evils that spread later on, and their latency is only revealed once time's passed. So Mill was a few years later than Bentham, and he rejected this kind of purely quantitative measurement of utility that Bentham looked at, and he tried to consider there being higher and lower pleasures. So he thought that things like intelligence,
knowledge and self-development long term is much more important than immediate desires such as I want to lay down, I want to take this drug, I want to eat. He saw, because one of the issues with Bentham's idea was he of course had this hedonic calculus, but nowhere in, well, he valued all pleasures as the same, and John Stuart Mill, he turned around and said, well, is this man's insane pleasure of taking a ton of drugs really equivalent to this other guy's great pleasure of finally getting married and having kids and being fulfilled in his workplace? It's a very different, much more higher quality pleasure, the latter,
yeah,
I would say.
And that's one of the criticisms that still goes on today to some extent, and whether the utilitarians really solve it or not is a different matter. But if it's all about maximizing pleasure, then why don't we just sit hooked up on heroin? I don't know, all day long, because that will provide us with the most pleasure compared to the mundanity of non-drugged life. Yeah. So, just moving through my notes. Mill, of course, is interesting because he sort of almost kind of undermines his argument in trying to prove it. He just says, look around. You look at the suffering of some of the happiness of others, and happiness must be good, therefore. And that is showing how he was an ethical naturalist, as in he could find moral truths from the world around him. But many argue that he's committing the naturalistic fallacy, which is where one takes...
You see...
Sorry.
What they ought to do from what they do.
What they in fact do, yeah. So, I don't know. People drive cars, thus we should drive cars. Well, that's not how that works. We should evaluate things on their own merits rather than just on what happens right now.
Yeah, because a lot of people within the moral naturalists will look at, for example, look at this bee or whatever that sacrificed itself for the greater good of the group, and then they'll deduce, therefore it was moral. It's moral for a bee to do that. Well, that's a fallacy. You're saying what is the reality is what ought to be done, which is you can't drive from the principles of looking around us to a principle of that must be morally correct.
Yeah.
And that's one of the fallacies that Mill commits in saying look around us and then trying to extrapolate it to therefore it's a good.
Right. So that's that's obviously important criticism of him. As we go more close to the present day, so Mill in fact did discuss other ideas of is virtue not what we should be aspiring to, but he argued that the virtues merely enable us to reach further happiness in the future. So yes, we should develop the virtues, but not because the virtues are themselves inherently great, but the consequences of developing those virtues are good. So you get other ideas such as Sidgwick, who we won't discuss in very much detail, beyond the fact that he tried to synthesize intuitionism, which is the idea that we get our moral principles just naturally without needing to either look at the world around us or think about it rationally, but that we can just feel them, just without even thinking, perhaps, and mix that and utilitarianism. In the more modern day, you got more development to the ideas of are there goods beyond just happiness. G.E. Moore was clean on that, and you get act and rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism is generally the one that people look at, which is the idea that every individual act that we take must be weighed up according to the theory, whether it's higher or lower pleasure, or the hedonic calculus of Bentham, and thus that should be what's done to promote the welfare. But there were lots of criticisms of that. It's so super subjective. Will we ever really know the consequences? And lots of people had some... they weren't too pleased with the act utilitarianism. So others created rule utilitarianism, and they tried to develop a system where they could legislate. And let's be clear here, Mill and Bentham didn't think we should just live kind of anarchically, just all individually following this. They were both involved in politics. They both legislated. So the impact that they would have had on more like down to earth, political philosophy is an important thing. We don't really have time for it today, but the rule utilitarians weren't exactly of a different sphere to them. They were very much intertwined.
Would you mind clarifying and defining what active rule utilitarianism is?
Sorry, I was just getting on to discussing what.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah,
unlike act utilitarianism, where each individual act is a different situation, you make up your own mind, subject specifically. Your rule utilitarianism, build a system of rules that should, as long as people observe those rules and so on, promote the greatest general welfare in the long run. So it could be something like, even though there might be individual circumstances in which murder is, according to act utilitarians, acceptable. The rule utilitarians might say, no, cold-blooded murder is never okay because of the possible downsides that could bring, as well as the possible upsides. So and rule utilitarian itself is divided into weak and strong rule utilitarianism. So that's whether those rules are absolutely fixed and you must follow them even when it does conflict with the promoting the welfare, promoting the utility. And the weaker utilitarianism says, well, maybe there are times when we can kind of flex those rules and do something that promotes the better social welfare, not social, but utility, or however you want to describe it. But of course, where you draw that bounding line, is there in fact time? Even if you say murder's wrong, is there a time when you can actually say murder's right? And thus, does rule utilitarianism just spiral chaotically down back into weak rule utilitarianism, that is, spiral back down chaotically into act utilitarianism?
Yep.
Sorry. Do you have anything more to add? Obviously, there are other forms we can discuss.
Yeah. So if we reiterate, so act utilitarianism is like the pure form of utilitarianism where it's sort of each individual act we will weigh the general utility of to see what will maximize well-being in that situation. While rule utilitarianism tries to deal with concepts of justice and making justice consistent in society by saying, well, murder generally, on the whole, decreases general well-being, so therefore we should prohibit it. And then yes, of course, you've talked about how many people say rule utilitarianism is flawed in the sense that for each rule there's also a situation in which defying the rules could be more could provide more utility, and as such you kind of spiral back down into act utilitarianism. But yeah, we've already talked about that. But I think really interesting as well is that there's some other developments nowadays. So for example, you have preference utilitarianism, which was developed by, well, it wasn't developed by Hare, but it was very it was held by Hare. It was also held by Peter Singer.
Are you sure preference utilitarianism? Oh no, sorry, you're very right. I'm very sorry. I have messed up there on my notes. Okay, please go on.
No, it's fine. Peter Singer is probably one of the most famous utilitarians of our modern generation. He held the position of preference utilitarianism for a very long time, and preference utilitarianism is a solution to some of the issues of modern utilitarianism. It's the position that instead of providing the most general well-being, we should try and fulfill the most personal interests or preferences through an act. So because this would actually solve the issue of sacrificing 100 people in a small injustice to give one guy a massive amount of joy, which would be justified under hedonistic utilitarianism, but it wouldn't be justified under preference utilitarianism because it's one person's preference versus 100 people's. Now, yes, people like Peter Singer held this view for a very long time. Um, but then Peter Singer's kind of moved towards hedonistic utilitarianism in recent years, just because of criticisms of preference utilitarianism, such as how do we weigh people's preferences against each other, which causes more issues because if you pretend like people's preferences do not outweigh each other, then you can have devastating consequences for society, wherein a majority dominates the minority, for example, in through horrendous acts. And there's also been other developments of utilitarianism. For example, negative utilitarianism, which was developed by Karl Popper, which was he was mostly interested in politics and systems like that, but he was also interested in morality. And negative utilitarianism is the idea that the central idea of utilitarianism should not be utility in the sense of maximizing well-being, but instead utility in the sense of minimizing pain and discomfort.
And
So,
of course, one of the large problems with the negative utilitarianism, and of course, where people still defend it, was the idea that, well, if we want to minimize pain, then we just kill the whole human race, or kill the whole human race and first create new beings that will just be happier instead, because of the suffering that goes on now. How do we ever really know if we're ever going to escape that? So thus, we need to end the whole thing before more pain goes on.
yeah.
And that's one of the things that's driven more people away from it, but it still has its own intellectual power today.
Yeah. So I think we've discussed basically all of utilitarianism. Of course, there's way more than that. There's way more substance to the arguments of Bentham and Mill, Sidgwick, modern utilitarians like Peter Singer, developments by people like Hare, people who have tried to synthesize, what's his name, like Parfit or something, who tried to
Oh yeah,
synthesize raw utilitarianism with deontology and contractualism, which we might mention later. But there's a lot of developments that we've not talked about, but that's the general gist of utilitarianism. Just maximize. If an outcome maximizes well-being, then it should be followed according to utilitarians. So,
should we move on to
should we move on to situation ethics, situation ethics is another form of consequentialism. And I'll leave it to you, Tom, because you obviously know much more than me in regards to situation ethics. But it's generally founded on situation ethics is very interesting because it's linked to it's just like how natural moral law was founded upon reason, but also influenced by religion. Situation ethics is also influenced by religion, but in a very different way. Because situation ethics has this idea of, well, legalism, which is like the rigid laws of the Old Testament and of natural moral law. It's too harsh and it's too rigid and doesn't, care about the individuality and the context and those things. But it also rejects just having no rules at all ethically. So it's kind of this middle point of situation ethics. The Christian and the religious influence on situation ethics is that situation ethics wants to distribute this Christian value of agape or unconditional love to the masses through acts that maximize love in a very consequentialist sense. So I'll leave it to you, Tom.
Brilliant. Okay, so situation ethics was developed by Joseph Fletcher in the 1960s. He was a Catholic priest, I think. Yeah. Initially, he then became an atheist later, who looked around at the world in which they were living, with changing ethical and social and civil norms. The sexual liberation movement was beginning. They just experienced this awful war, which had made many question whether there was even a god in the first place, which is something we actually talked about on last fortnight's episode. And he asked, well, is there some middle ground that we can find, as Sully was saying, between what is antinomianism, which is where there were no laws at all and we just follow our own moral codes, whether that is just egoism or whether that is utilitarianism or such like that, and the other side of the coin, which was legalism, which is the idea that we should just follow precise laws, and is perhaps expressed best by deontological schools of thought. So once we try and plot a middle path through that Fletcher thought, and combining the religious aspect, he considered that the one principle that would allow us to go down that, cross that river, go through there, the middle of it all, would be the religious concept of agape. So agape is just another term that I think perhaps C.S. Lewis is influential in its meaning today. He was a theologian as well as a writer of some great books, in my opinion. So agape is, sorry, that was. I feel like I am taking my time today. My brain is not quite in gear.
Don't worry.
Thank you. So agape is this kind of selfless, situationless love that should be displayed by Christians according to Jesus. So we look out to our neighbours and we show this love, and that takes various different forms. And it's quite similar to the idea of charity. We don't look at who they are or where they've, what they've done, but rather just show this, unrequited, selfless caring and love for other people. So quite unlike natural moral law, rather than being the principle being trying to find eudaimonia, it was to promote the most love to the most number of people. And the way it went for the middle ground was that it still supported a legal framework, but it argued that if there was ever a decision where love would be maximised by choosing another option, then you should follow that decision rather than just following the baseline law.
Yeah.
That would be advocated by deontological believers, and it's kind of reinforced by theological ideas. So Jesus, for instance, I believe, worked on the Sabbath to help someone in need, thus contravening a religious law which would have broken one of the primary precepts, perhaps, of natural moral law of worshipping God. That is. But because it promoted the most love, Jesus continued to do it anyway. And it was like the same kind of morality. That same kind of view on ethics that was the one that Fletcher hoped to emulate in situation ethics. And so there are some key principles of the six working principles and four.
No, the 4 working principles and 6 fundamental propositions.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
Oh yes, yeah, there we go. So the 4 working principles are pragmatism. So you should be looking at the situation, and you've got to be practical. You can't just call on some far-fetched authority. You've got to look at what is the best here and now. Relativism. You can't. There's no objective, truth as to what the best course is. You've got to look at the situation with this relative mindset. You should avoid words like never, complete, and perfect, so on. Positivism. You've got to look for outside yourself. You can't just look introspectively. Positivism in the sense of sharing God's love with you. For example, one of the teachings in John 4:7-12 is let us love one another because love is from God. So yeah. I mean, go on.
So the way I understood positivism is this idea of Fletcher was asked the question, why is love the central principle? And this isn't positivism of the typical philosophical sense, which is quite weird because I understand why it's weird for him to use a word that doesn't generally associated with different meaning. But positivism, to Fletcher at least, was his solution to why should love be the central principle, and it's this leap of faith. Like, I want to spread love because I trust in God, and God is love, and I want to distribute that love, essentially.
Brilliant. And the last one is personalism. You want to look at what benefits people before the law itself. What matters fundamentally is, the people around you and the situation you're in.
Put people above laws.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the most important. That's one of the most important working principles. Then there's the fundamental propositions or fundamental principles as well. So they include things like there's only one intrinsic good, that's love. Love wills the neighbour's good. We should send off love, not expecting anything in return, and that they're made situationally, not prescriptively. There's nothing inherently right or wrong, but it should be done to favour the most loving thing to the situation. So that's pretty much an overview of it. There's many criticisms of it from the church as much as by atheists. And to be fair, Joseph actually did become an atheist towards the end of his life. Hello, we're back. I just went to go and get a drink because we've been talking for quite a while now. So we've just done situation ethics, virtue ethics. Yeah, go on. Sully, you explain that. You're the man, I think, of the hour.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So virtue ethics is, so as we talked about it before, it's a very weird approach to normative ethics because deontology took the act, looked at the duties associated with the act, looked at rules and the innate nature of the act, and said that decides the morality of the act. You know, consequentialism and teleological theories. They looked at where that act takes you. You know, what the effect of it is on the world, and said that determines what's right and wrong. But then virtue ethics said approach on the act in an isolated manner is sort of insignificant. You know, acts are representations of virtues. They develop a virtuous character, and what actually matters is developing one's virtue, developing oneself into this eudaimonic state of human flourishing, because essentially virtue ethics came from Aristotle, who developed it from, as he talked about before, ideas of Plato's forms or whatever. But yeah, it was mainly Aristotelian, this development. So virtue ethics came from Aristotle, who believed in this idea of eudaimonia and of human flourishing, and he believed that the only way to properly flourish as a human was to be, perfectly virtuous, however ridiculous that may sound, to be as virtuous as possible, to be as kind as possible, to have developed yourself. And the way to do this, Aristotle...
Hang on a second. I think that is perhaps slightly misrepresenting it because of the golden mean.
But I mean, not as in... I don't mean I mean having the quality of being virtuous.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Not as in...
Yeah, no, I understand.
Not as in situations or an absolute. So what I'm saying is...
Sorry, yeah.
The idea of being... having developed one's kindness to a great standard, for example, would be a virtue. So Aristotle believed in the development of one's virtues, and so to the virtue ethicist, a moral act is one that helps one develop a virtue of the character. And for example, that means that an act of kindness is moral because it develops my virtue of kindness and makes me a kinder person. And that's kind of the principle of virtue ethics. And to Aristotle, this essentially this idea of virtues and vices was central to Aristotle, and virtues and vices were character traits. And what Aristotle saw was the virtue isn't just some random abstract thing, but that the virtue actually lies in between two vices, a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess, and that one has to find in every circumstance, using their practical wisdom, their practical, almost like their practical reason of Kant, in the Kantian sense, the practical wisdom in a situation, to find what is the virtue in between vices of deficiency and vices of excess. And I'll give you an example. So in a situation, you could be, say you're giving money, you have to give money away to charity or whatever. If you give barely anything, that would be a vice of deficiency. You're quite greedy, actually. But if you give too much, you're being wasteful, So you have to use your practical wisdom in the situation to find the golden mean, the virtue of being generous while not being too generous, while not being too selfish. And that was central to Aristotle's idea of the golden mean and of practical wisdom and of developing oneself into a virtuous figure, into this position of eudaimonia. Is everything okay, Tom? Yeah, that's just generally the idea of virtue ethics, developing one's virtues, finding the middle ground between not doing something enough and doing something too much in regards to character traits, to find this golden mean, this virtue. And this was Aristotle's idea, and it was basically very influential in the period it was in, but soon came in deontological religious ideas and things like divine command theory that quickly changed the cultural perception of what morality should be, far away from virtue ethics. And as such, virtue ethics was basically made fun of and mocked by most moral philosophers in the past, 1,000 years or whatever. And it's only been recently that virtue ethics has been revived in the 20th century Aristotelic turn, I think it's called, which was when a bunch of people they were dissatisfied by the lack of answers in deontology and teleological ethics at least, and they turned to this old Aristotelian idea of virtue ethics, and they revived it, slightly changing the virtues to make them more appealing to the common day. Because, of course, for Aristotle, he lived, back in the ancient Greek period, so a lot of the virtues he prescribed were very old-fashioned. For example, one of the virtues was don't be a buffoon, which was, it's interesting to reflect on that historically, but I don't know whether not being a fool is really so much relevant today as a virtue. But yes, what they did was they took this principle of self-development at the core of morality and provided their own new virtues. That's what the new virtue ethicists did to the theory, while all the while still focusing on the idea of eudaimonia and the fact that through virtuous acting one can become a virtuous figure who is truly happy with life and with their interests. Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good summary of it. I would add perhaps the idea of phronesis.
Phronesis is the idea of so phronesis is the Greek word for practical wisdom, which is that thing we were talking about before, which is in a situation it's not always going to be the same. For example, if you're dealing with someone who's extremely poor and struggling, the act of being generous with your money is going to be much more weighted towards giving more than if you're giving some money to a guy who's quite well off already. So you have to find that balance of where that virtue is between the two vices of too little and too much, the deficiency and excess. So yeah, one in each and every circumstance must use their practical wisdom to figure out where that is, use reasoning. And in a sense, you could actually use, in those circumstances, deontological, teleological ideas to justify where the position lies, perhaps, or even just one's own intuition. So it's quite interesting how open this leaves you to be compatible and open to other, forms of thought,
Well, I certainly like the blending almost of deontological and teleological things. So it does instruct you to follow these virtues, but the interpretation of those virtues is
up to you.
More individual. I think the new wave of virtue ethics is really interesting, especially Alistair McIntyre and people like that.
Yeah.
And the idea that we could have kind of culturally relative, societally created virtues for the different ages. It kind of relates to the old, Marxian and anarchist conceptions of, changing ethics following whether it's the dialectic or different social times. Maybe unlike some of the other schools of ethics, but obviously you can have those in other ones as well. But unlike perhaps utilitarianism or Kantian ethics, what makes one ethical changes over time and develops socially rather than being created by one man's introspection or one man's view of animal suffering. So I think that is one of its great benefits, but it also has its downsides. I mean, there's lots of shakiness around how you actually interpret those values into deciding whether an action is right or wrong, and there's are those virtues actually relevant anymore, and so on? Are they culturally
Yeah.
Are they culturally relevant, relative even, and thus there's no objective and way throughout the whole of the world? And does that mean it's lesser than the other theories? And
Tom,
yes, sorry.
I was going to say, I think a really interesting thing I just thought of was, um, a lot of people criticize the virtue ethics for being very individualistic and self-oriented, and almost, uncaring of others. But I think a really interesting parallel thing we can compare to last episode where we talked about Sartre, as how they talk about authenticity and how to be authentic in oneself requires and necessitates the authenticity of others. And I think in the same sense, in this cooperative sense we see in
Yeah.
left-wing politics as well. There's this idea that yes, it's very self-centered to develop virtues just for oneself, but those virtues, things like kindness, actually are us developing ourselves so that we can help others through our own self-development. And I think that's a very interesting idea that links to authenticity
Well,
and the role of our cooperation within society.
I definitely agree with that. I would say, it's like kind of combination of the collective and the individual. How do you maintain the individual's freedom but also build these collective projects? And it's very interesting, and it's very relevant to what I'm just about to get onto, which is I was going to mention Rosa Luxemburg's socialist civic virtues, which were what she advocated for people,
People who are socialists,
to follow, and is kind of similar. So they were, instead of them being like generosity or kindness and the like, were militancy, solidarity, collectivism, self-activity, and tenacity and struggle. So you can see how it's very adaptable as a system, and it combines that both individual but that subjective element, but also with that more not objective but social element as well. And I was just going to mention, like you were talking about, the ethics of ambiguity. So very similarly, actually, to virtue ethics, the ethics of ambiguity, which is the ethics of Simone de Beauvoir, which is what we talked about a little bit briefly last episode. They're very much focused on what makes a good person. Well, not what makes a good person, but how should we live holistically. And it doesn't offer really an answer more than this is how we should not live so much. So the thing about existentialism is that we have this freedom that is supreme. So how do but de Beauvoir also understood from Hegel the idea that we can only understand ourselves, our own existence, through our knowledge of others. Thus, thus we have this kind of ambiguity. In fact, that's what it's called, where our relationship to others defines us and objectifies us, but we can't actually define ourselves without interacting with others. And you kind of get this, like we said last time, this interweaving kind of path where you can never find this objective truth as to what you should do and how you should act, but you do know that you have to weave your way through these two sides of this facticity, this what defined you and you provides context for you, and also your own freedom emanating from the fact that without other people you have a nothingness, you have this unbelievable infinity because you're not defined by anything else. So she gives examples of who people shouldn't act as she says, so similar to the idea of bad faith in Sartre's work. So that the subman who avoids all questions of freedom and assumes himself not to free, the serious man, the adventurer, the passionate man who cares enthusiastically about their goal but shares similar contempt for others. What the whole argument is that we have to build our own freedom individually, but the only way we can do that is by building collective freedom. So there we go. Right, that's the ethics of ambiguity done. I think that may be all our key theories done. It's only taken us about an hour to do them.
I mean, it's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I think we may need to
So,
split this episode in two. Again,
maybe two, maybe three if we go too long
three. That's
on
true, actually. Yeah.
meta ethics, which it'll be fine. We'll just talk about whatever we're interested in, and we'll decide how to split it later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we've covered all the ethical theories. I would mention contractualism if I was much more well read on the topic. It comes from contractualism is basically a form of deontology that is very different to other deontological theories in the sense that it requires adherence to laws, but laws that are defined by a social contract, and it very much values the individual and one's position in relation to the social contract. And it was developed by thinkers such as Rawls, who was a liberal thinker, and later by who was it specifically? Scanlon. He developed it afterwards, and I'm not going to go into depth, but it basically has these ideas of valuing the individual's relation to society, and this idea that we should bring up the bottom person, like the person who's worst off in society, we should bring up their well-being as much as possible, because in the Rawlsian sense, he talked about this idea of the original position, which is this veil of ignorance. Pretend we were told to make a society and then make the rules for a society without knowing exactly what position we'd be in the society. We may be an extremely poor person, we may be a normal person, we could be an extremely rich person. We don't know what our position in society would be when making it. Pretend you're in that situation. You would try to make society as fair as possible and to bring up the bottom person and minimize their suffering, so that it's fair for all.
And the conclusion that Rawls drew from that was a kind of liberal, having rights to things, which is a deontological sense.
Exactly.
But some degree of equality and fairness with that.
And contractualism is very interesting. This idea, it has ideas such as utilitarianism. One of the main criticisms of it is this idea of aggregation, which is this idea that you get one person who is sacrificed for the many, because what you've done is you've aggregated or put together the pleasures or the wills of many people to overwhelm this one person and their will. While contractualism tries to value the individual. So a very weird thing about contractualism is actually within contractualist theory, an individual can object to if there's an option between one individual getting 10 days of suffering and 10 individuals getting 5 days of suffering, the person who's getting 10 days of suffering, as they're the worst person off, can object and say, look, there's another situation in which another individual only gets 5 days of suffering, and they don't care about the collective because we're comparing based on individuals. And it's a very weird system because under contractualism,
no bias there.
You actually have to. Yeah, well, weird as in it's not bad. I just think it's very interesting, the approach, because under contractualism, for example, if there's a choice between saving one life and saving 2 lives, you don't take the 2 lives. You would weigh the worth of A's complaint. Sorry, if there's A on one side and B and C on the other side, you would weigh the complaints of A against B, and then the complaints of A against C. And if A is equal to B, and A is equal to C, you do a coin flip to give everyone a 50% chance of living, which is a very weird concept, because under utilitarianism, you would weigh A against B and C, which would obviously skew it in favor of B and C. So it's interesting, this idea that it's all about individual struggle. But yes, I have not explained contractualism very well, and please go and read about it if you would like to know more about it, because it's an interesting approach to deontology, definitely, that I think can fix a lot of issues with deontological thought. There's obviously the criticisms of contractualism, such as it is a bit unfair to sacrifice 10 people under less suffering than one person who's going to have just slightly more suffering. But yeah, anyway, those are basically all the ethical theories we'd like to talk about today. I'd say let's move on to meta-ethics, because meta-ethics is really interesting as well.
Thanks for listening to that instalment of the New Dogs Old Tricks podcast. The next one will be about meta-ethics and our concluding remarks on the whole of what we've studied so far over the course of this ethics episode.